So I am new, but not that new.
All right, unmuted us. Hi, everybody, it's time. This is January 9th, 2022. This is our first class back in the new year. Our Teacher's Day is Dr. Ron Serino. He's the Director of Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Memphis. He's new to us, and we're thrilled to have him here. The topic, as you can see on the television, is race in the Bible in the United States. So that should be good. Are there any announcements or any prayer requests? Next week, we have Dr. Janelle Baker from Memphis Theological Seminary. Are there any prayer concerns we should have? Okay, I'll start quickly. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for the chance to come here and learn about your word and worship you. As you speak through the teacher today and through the pastors and the other people in church later today. For all things, we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. To get closer to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Daniel, and everyone for the invitation. And can you hear me okay with my mask on? All right.
You're allowed to take it off if you want to.
Okay. Well, if you're having any problems hearing me, please let me know. I usually do teach with it on at the University of Memphis, but if you can't hear me, we're at a safe distance, probably, hopefully, who knows these days, but please let me know if you can't hear me or understand me. My name is Ron Serino, and I have a PhD in biblical interpretation from Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, and my specialty is in Hebrew Bible and Old Testament. And most of my research has to do with the way that the Bible supported the construction of race in the early colonial period in North America. And so that's kind of the big topic for today, race in the Bible in the United States, which, you know, we could discuss for much longer than we have today, but I'll try to hit on a few what I think are some of the main topics or highlights. And I invite and encourage you at any time, just stop me, wave your hand if you have a question, if you want to know anything more specific about anything that I've said, or you have a question about something that I haven't said, please don't hesitate to ask me or stop me anytime. So again, thank you for this opportunity. I'm very glad to be here today. I think it's important to, when we're talking about race and the Bible, especially in the United States, to talk just for a second about what do we mean by each of these ideas. So, you know, what is race? Often race is something that many of us think that we just sort of inherently know what it is without really stopping to think about exactly what it is. Because I think when we do stop to think about exactly what it is, it gets very complex and complicated very fast. So, but just off the top of your head, what is race to you?
I thought it was all, but I don't think there is this, I guess there is no such thing.
Okay.
I thought it was all, definitely the white race, you know, the ones that you could, white race. And I'm confused that now, we talk about race, but if it doesn't exist, then how can we talk about it?
Okay, so thank you for saying that. He's saying that, you know, on the one hand, race doesn't exist. So biologically speaking, there's no clearly defined racial groups. We all share the same DNA, biology. There's more variation within the so-called races than there is between the so-called races, biologically speaking. So from a biological standpoint, you're exactly right, race doesn't exist. And so this idea has been talked about more and more recently. Whereas some of us in older generations were taught a different thing when we were in school, that there were such thing as biological races, and you could talk about these different biological races, but that's something that's no longer considered, at least academically, to be correct. So, but however, there are these different races, as you mentioned, white, black, and so on. And that has more to do with the concept of what is race in the United States, or what is race. And so there are these different social, I would call them social and historical categories of what race is. So race has been defined, especially in the United States, in social ways and in historical ways. So there are, that have effects in historically and currently today. So race is, real for us socially and historically, even though it doesn't exist for biologically. So I don't know if that kind of helps at all. Any other ideas? Thank you for sharing that. Any other ideas about what is race? I've got some ideas that I had up here. I don't know, it might be hard for you to see, but I'll talk about some of the. Ethnicity is the first one, and ethnicity is an idea that overlaps with race to such an extent that I just talk about race and ethnicity together. There are ways to talk about race and ethnicity differently, whereas race might have more to do with, say, skin color, especially in the United States, where that's the big determiner, usually skin color, or looks, what's sometimes called phenotype in academic language, the way people's hair, skin, body types, and things like that. And so that's generally what we popularly think of as race in the United States, whereas ethnicity might have more to do for us with culture, language, our religion, our food, our customs. But these are so intertwined and overlapping that I think it's difficult to really separate them completely. Many of us think about race in terms of geographical origin. So my ancestors are primarily from Europe, for example, or primarily from Africa or Asia. And we kind of use that as a way to talk about what race is and tie it a little bit to the biological thing. Okay, because I have my certain DNA from a certain area of the world. But it's very complicated when you try to make these distinct, I'm this, you're that. It gets a lot more complicated, because what if some of these, overlap, or they're different? Maybe I have black skin, but I have, I speak Spanish and I'm Catholic and things like that. Am I black, or am I Latino, or, but my family moved here from, Asia. And so that's, it gets very complicated.
So is it heredity?
It could be, yeah. I mean, that could be a way of thinking about it. My basic point here is just trying to complexify and trouble the idea that there's not a simple categories the way that we popularly think about them. But there are differences in accesses to resources and power, and this has to do with our social historical categories, laws in the United States, for example, about race-based slavery, about legal segregation and things like that in our history that have to do with, still have effects today. And so one way that people recently have been talking about race is in terms of caste. And this word caste is something that you might associate more with India, for example, where there's certain stratifications of people based on their families and their communities, about what jobs they can have and what access to resources they have and things like that. And so people recently have said that looks a lot more like how race functions in the United States, where based on who your parents are and where your community is, has a lot to do with what your actual access to resources are. So that's just a little bit about what is race, something that seems maybe obvious, but it might not be so exactly obvious. So how many and what are the races? Where are the dividing lines? And then who decides what race? So can I just declare what race I am? Or does society tell me or treat me a certain way? Does the US government, for example, and the census and the boxes that you check, does that what determines what your race is? So all this to say, it's complex. modern ideas of race first developed in the early modern context of European imperialism and colonialism. So when the English came to North America, for example, the very first census that was here in the early 1600s talked about people in the colonies were either English or they were Negroes. And so this was two census categories in the earliest census in the English North American colonies, where the English colonists were thinking of themselves primarily as English. This is a little bit before, just before they begin to think of themselves as white, but they're already defining Africans. Primarily Africans first came to the North America through the Spanish, pre-existing Spanish slave trade. So Africans came to Virginia, for example, and were sold originally as enslaved people. And so the English differentiated between themselves and these other people, the Negroes. Okay.
They didn't count the Native Americans at all?
That's a great question. And the reason they didn't count the Native Americans at all is because Native Americans, there was an idea early on that there would be this, sharing and joint community. For example, the colony of Massachusetts, its earliest motto was "Come and help us." And so this idea that English were, helping Native Americans and they were all going to live together, but that quickly broke down in violent skirmishes and conflicts, both in Virginia and in Massachusetts, such that all Native Americans were excluded and banned from English colonial settlements. So they could still maybe live, they couldn't live together, they could work together, they could go visit a Native American village nearby, for example, but they weren't allowed to be part of the colonial settlement. So that's why you don't see in the earliest censuses Native Americans. But I think that's a good question about how did they view each other, for sure. Excuse me. Another important point that I want to make is that definitions of race frequently change in different times and places with different social historical contexts. So I've just mentioned how the earliest English colonists in North America thought of themselves primarily as English. But then I'm going to show how they're going to think of themselves more as white in just a little bit. So in the United States today, social historical categories that provide access to power or prevent people from accessing power and resources are primarily based on skin color, but also including other factors that I mentioned earlier as far as ethnicity. And that's primarily what race is, as I see it today in the United States. And this, getting to our topic today for race in the Bible, this modern idea of what race is did not exist in the ancient context of the Bible. So, that's one of my points that I want to make. When we read the Bible, I don't think it's correct to read our ideas of what race is into the Bible. But that's exactly what we have done in the history of the interpretation of the Bible, especially in European and American contexts.
Tribes were considered different, they had different tribes.
And
Considered racial tribes?
yes, okay, so there's definitely different tribes, and I'm going to talk about that. There's different, what's often called nations. So, excuse me, groups of people. I think there's definitely what we would consider ethnicity in terms of there's different language, there's different religions, there's different customs, there's different national origins and geographic origins. But my point about race and sort of race in terms of caste and hierarchy of power and resources, that idea of what we understand race popularly to be today is not present in the Bible. And so I'm going to go through a couple of examples so we can think about that. But before I do that, I want to also question and just raise the question of what is the Bible? I think, again, many of us think we know what the Bible is. It's sitting right over here. or it's on your phone, or you have a copy. But again, it's not quite that simple. There are different, even among different Christian groups, there are slightly different Bibles. Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic, for example, have books, additional books that are considered authoritative and sacred scripture than we do in Protestant Bibles. So during the Protestant Reformation, there was feelings that some of the apocryphal text, what we consider apocryphal texts, were not authoritative and sacred. And so the early Protestant leaders decided to go back to the form of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament that was used by Jewish people within Judaism. And that did not include some of these later Greek texts that are early Christian texts that are included in Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles. So that's one reason why when we say the Bible, we have to be a little bit more specific. And then even more importantly, I think for me and for this discussion, every translation and every reading of the Bible is an interpretation. That is, the Bible was written in Hebrew and in Greek. So if we're reading it in English, someone, unless we're great scholars, has translated that ancient Greek and Hebrew into English. And in translating, if you know anything about language, you have to make, it's not exact matches between words, between phrases, there's idioms. And so someone has to decide exactly what do those words mean and what's the best way to express them in the English language. And I think translators do a really great job, but there's still some fuzzy edges that there's no way to avoid. So it's interesting to think about. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate that. One way to think about how every reading of the Bible is an interpretation is to think about three interpretive worlds of the Bible. And you may be familiar with this. This is not my idea. But the first world or area to think about when you're reading the Bible is that there's an ancient context. That is, there was an ancient culture in which this Bible passage or book was produced. And there were certain cultural and social historical contexts that went into that. So you mentioned the tribes. You know, if we're talking about Israelites and Canaanites, there was a certain context for that, culturally, historically, socially. And that goes into what is part of this ancient context that lie kind of behind the creating or the production of the ancient Hebrew text. So then the second area or world is the texts themselves. And so, you know, what do the words what do the words say? What do even the translations, the English words say? And that is kind of the second area. And then the third is our modern context. That is, as modern people, as modern readers, as modern interpreters, how do we read and understand the words themselves, and what's our idea or impression of the ancient context, if we think about that. And so the reason I think this is important is because another sort of popular way of reading the Bible today is the idea that the Bible is a message, directly from God to us, which is a great and interesting way to read the Bible, but it kind of leaves aside all these ancient contexts and what do the words themselves say, and how do our own history and social experiences influence the way that we read and understand, whether it's our education or our own social setting. So I think it's, while in some cases devotionally, it can be very helpful and useful to read the Bible as a direct message from God to us, when we're trying to understand some of the more complex or nuanced cultures or contexts of the Bible, it's more helpful to think about these different areas of interpretation. So given that, how do our modern context of race in America influence or affect the way that we read the Bible? when we see these different tribes, for example, that you mentioned, do we overlay our ideas of race onto that and read into that? And I basically think that yes, we do. And so one central question here is, who is Israel? The Bible is written from, especially the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, is written from the context of ancient Israel and from the viewpoint of ancient Israel, and it's primarily about ancient Israel's relationship with God, and the God that they identify as the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is the God who, according to the text, created the world, provides help and salvation for people, and is the same God that Jesus and the New Testament points to as being heirs of this promise that God made to Israel to have a special relationship with. So this concept of Israel as God's chosen people, I think, is very central to how Christians read the Bible, how Jews read the Bible as well, but how us modern people in the United States read the Bible. And it has to do with a concept called exceptionalism, which has to do with uniqueness. So biblical exceptionalism basically is the idea that Israel is a unique nation, a unique people. They have a special relationship with God, and as God's chosen people, and God has appointed them to be God's messengers, hands, feet in the world. And the way that people today understand Israel has a lot to do with how we read the Bible.
Well, certainly in this country, the US is, have that feeling.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. You're anticipating what I'm going to say. Relating to this biblical exceptionalism, the idea of uniqueness is Israel, especially when we get to the New Testament, is the idea of Christian exceptionalism. That is, that Christians are God's, as the New Testament says, new Israel. Christians have now, according to the New Testament, in some interpretations, many popular ones, sort of replaced Israel and Judaism as God's special people, the people that God has a special relationship. And this, in Christianity, we would call this the doctrine of election. That is, God has elected us to be his chosen, the receivers of God's grace, God's salvation, which, depending on how you interpret it, is not necessarily for everyone, but just those who God has chosen, or those who do certain things like accept Jesus or things like that. All right. So then if we have biblical exceptionalism, Israel is unique. Christian exceptionalism, Christians are God's new Israel. Then what you just said, early English settlers, colonists in North America, can you go back? Sorry, thank you. Saw themselves as also exceptional. They saw North America as God's promised land for the English and other European settlers, and talked about themselves and their settlements as a city on a hill. So John Winthrop, for example, in the 1630s, talked about the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a city on the hill. God is establishing them to bring light and salvation to the savages, to the primitive people. Excuse me. So this is the idea that we would now call the beginnings of American exceptionalism. That is, we in the United States have a certain uniqueness because we are a people that have been, you could say, appointed by God, but have a special relationship and are bringing, you might not say salvation necessarily if you're talking about secular American exceptionalism, but you might say democracy, or you might say capitalism, or good ways of living and economics, medicine, or things like that to the world. And this is because we are exceptional as a people, as a nation, as Americans. And so this idea has been very popular throughout United States history, especially with in the 20th century with the Second World War, and we won the Second World War, we won the Cold War, and why? Because we are exceptional and we need to be leaders in the world. And so this final point here, as far as where did whiteness come from, this concept of the white race in America historically developed out of the categories of English. Remember I said the first census in the colonies was English people and Negro people. But then as more other nationalities, other ethnicities from Europe began settling in the colonies, there were Irish and Scots, and there were French, and there were Spanish. So they couldn't, but they were still different from, they still saw themselves different from Africans or Negroes, and different from Native Americans. And so they began to think of themselves as Christians. So this early definition of Christian in the censuses was basically what we think of as white, but it was European people. So the census in maybe the mid 1600s, you were either Christian or you were Negro or you were Native American. So this is, that idea of Christian, you can sort of see where people today think of, we'll say that the United States is a Christian nation, and that, we have to get back to this idea of being a Christian nation, and mixed in with, it's partly religious, but it's also racial and ethnic, because this idea of Christian came out of, in US history, the idea of Englishness and white Europeanness. And so from English and Christian, we get by the late 17th century, the late 1600s, the idea of the white race in America. And so we begin to see from the late 1600s on in censuses, this idea of white people and whiteness. Thank you.
What about, the problem with asking questions is it displays how stupid you are.
Oh, please don't, please don't.
But, when did Jews come into the picture in the US?
In the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have the definitive history on that. I do know that the oldest synagogue building in the United States was from early 1700s in Rhode Island, I believe. So Jews have certainly been here for a while. I believe originally they came in through New Amsterdam, the colony that's now New York City. And so Jews were involved for various historical reasons in medieval Europe with trade and merchant activity, especially banking, because according to Christian and then, just sort of Christian law in medieval Europe, of course, is national law, or there's no difference between the church and the state in medieval Europe. So Christians, as the way they read the Bible, were not permitted to lend money to one another. And so they needed certain third parties to be able to borrow money and lend money and things like that, because the Bible says, you shouldn't lend money to other, your brethren, again, who is Israel. So their Christians are seeing themselves as the subject of the Bible and, not referring to Jews. And so that was okay. That could, Jews were involved in European economic activity in that way. And so that's a little bit of what I know about that question. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking. Jews identify as ethnically. Okay, I see what you're saying now.
And so I was just wondering, in the American scene, when did the early settlers seem to just, the Jews didn't seem to be around, I guess, because I would in Europe were not Jews from the Christian perspective. They were the other.
Yes, right. And so if you go back to, you don't have to change the slide, but if you go back in the historical sort of development of race, it did come out of this idea of religion. And so especially in medieval Europe, white, what we would consider white Europeans thought of themselves as Christian, and then thought of the other peoples or groups, what we would maybe call the early beginnings of race, as Jews and Muslims who were there. So in the writings, they talk about Christians and as opposed to Jews and Muslims, basically setting them apart as a different people. So a related question, which I think is where maybe you're going with this, and correct me if I'm wrong, is how did Jews, sort of become white in the way that they are today? Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yeah, and I'm interested.
Yeah.
I'm interested in everything you're saying.
Okay.
I'm just trying to figure out how the Jews figure it.
Yeah, so I mean, that was actually very recent in terms of Jews either being considered white because of this idea that primarily in the United States, race is based on skin color. So if many Jews have European ancestry, and so today many Jews are considered and think of themselves as white, even though I would say even in the mid 20th century that was not the case. If you think about a lot of the positions of the KKK and some other white supremacist groups, they're very much not considering Jews as part of the white race. In fact, the recent Charlottesville march a couple of years ago, one of the chants that was being chanted by the guys with the torches was, "Jews will not replace us." And so still very much this anti-Jewish sentiment and separation of that within whiteness. But I think for most people, Jews who have white looking skin are treated by society as white, and they don't go around wearing. That's why in medieval Europe, of course, there was these laws passed that they had to wear gold stars or certain special hats or something like that, so that the Christian people in medieval Europe could say, "Oh, there's a Jew," and so that relates to the Holocaust and a whole lot of other things. So I don't know if that, okay. So
I'm going to get you off track.
no, that's not at all off track. Exactly on track. Okay. So now I'll get to kind of what you had alluded to, Barbara, at the very beginning about the different tribes. So what is, if Israel is the sort of the subject of the Bible, the Canaanites are the prototypical other that are talked about as lower or dirty or not desirable, people that should be driven out from the Israel and Israelite settlements. And so related to that is this idea of the nations that I mentioned earlier. And what we see in our Bibles in English as the nations is a translation of, in the Hebrew Bible, goyim, but it's just this word that means Gentiles or non-Jews. So when the Old Testament, or even sometimes the New Testament, uses this Greek word ethne, so when the Bible talks about the nations, or you read this word nations in your Bible, that means non-Jews in its ancient and cultural context. Now we would define nations a little bit differently today. That's as an example of what I mean about how our modern context and information and experiences affects the way that we read and interpret. So we're reading nations and as more of a sort of United Nations. There's many different nations of the world. We are one. But actually in the Bible, this word nations means the other people. If you're familiar with the concept of sort of Greeks and barbarians, barbarians was everyone who was not Greek. This is the same, the Jews use the same term for Gentiles, everyone who's not Jewish. You're not us, okay? You're not Israel. Getting back to the idea of who is Israel, who's us, right? And so nations are other people, and this is in the way is that people have and could read into the Bible this idea of racial othering. So othering, just separating from us, not us, you, Canaanites, and the Canaanites, according to the Bible, are the ones that should be driven out, expelled. And the conquest of Canaan is something that's religiously authorized. God says, go and expel the Canaanites, right? Drive the Canaanites from the land. this idea and these biblical texts, such especially the book of Joshua, for example, are used by early European colonists and settlers to justify colonization and imperialization in North America. So in their early texts in the 1600s, at the same time they're talking about we're a city on the hill, we're here to bring salvation. They're also talking about, if that doesn't work, we're authorized by God and our religion and our king, our nation, to use violence to drive out the native peoples, indigenous peoples, in order to make room for ourselves, God's chosen people. So I just wanted to look at a few passages to help sort of explain this idea of how white European Americans often will read race into the Bible or interpret the Bible in sort of racialized ways. And so that's what these are about. One important point I think to make is that slavery, while often racialized for us, because that's our social and historical context in the United States, where we have many hundred years of race-based, legal race-based slavery. Slavery is not racialized in the Bible, but rather it's considered to be just a pre-existent feature of life in many ancient cultures of the Bible. So it's included, it's not necessarily celebrated, but it's not questioned either in both the Old and New Testaments. So for example, Joseph in Genesis 37 is sold into slavery and in Egypt, right? And that's like, it's not good. It's like, oh, too bad, that stinks for him. But it's not like the Genesis is questioning the institution of slavery, right? It doesn't go, it just says, oh, that's terrible for him, Similarly, in the New Testament, if you look at the letter to Philemon, there's this idea that, Onesimus should be set free, if you're because he's a Christian, that's the reason that's given, right? Philemon should set his slave Onesimus free because they're both Christians, and it's not right to enslave other Christians, which gets back to this idea of who's us and who's Israel. We shouldn't be enslaving each other, but Paul doesn't question the institution of slavery, right? So slavery, the basic point is slavery is not racialized in the Bible, but we often read that into it. So the Bible, of course, is used by both progressives and conservatives in US social history. That is, we don't all read the Bible in the same way, and we often read in the Bible sort of our own social context and experience, such that the Bible has been used, if you talk about the slavery idea in US history, by both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates, both pointed to the Bible to justify their stances, right? So abolitionists, an example of that would be Exodus 21:16, which says, do not kidnap, trade, or keep people as commodities. So that seems to be a pretty strong argument for the abolition of the institution of slavery, because the Bible is saying, you shouldn't be involved in this. However, there's other places in the Bible, for example, Leviticus 25, that says, God says to Moses and the people of Israel, you may take slaves from the foreigners around and among you. So God is saying in the laws of the priestly Levitical codes of Leviticus that it's okay and permissible and authorized for the people of Israel to enslave the foreigners that are around and among you. So getting back to the question again of who is Israel? So if we can figure out who's we and who's you and them, then it's permissible according to this interpretation for us to enslave you or them, right? That's the way the Bible is, kind of gets back to what is the Bible. The Bible is a complex series of passages written over hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years, in different social, cultural, historical settings, and doesn't always speak with necessarily the same voice. Okay. So let's look at this idea of the Exodus or liberation as a case point. In Exodus, there's this liberation story about the struggle and victory of the God of the Hebrew slaves over the Egyptians. Okay. Now this one story, it might have an ancient context. It has, which is the first world of the Bible. It has certain words that it's written in Hebrew or English translation, the second world of the Bible. But the third world, how do modern readers interpret it? And this slide demonstrates how there's been wildly different and even sometimes contradictory ways that people in the United States have interpreted this passage. So originally, Exodus and liberation was used by some English colonial settlers who were fleeing England, fleeing religious persecution in England, fleeing away from some of the legal laws that they might not have liked or might have oppressed them in England. And so they used this idea that God was inspiring and authorizing them to overthrow their English overlords, especially in ideas like the American colonists put out during the American Revolution about throwing off this oppressive British domination that they were living under in colonialism. Likewise, the Southern Confederacy used this story to talk about how they were throwing off the oppression of the Northern Union, and that God was inspiring and authorizing them to engage in this civil war as a way of getting rid of these oppressive overlords. So the Northerners were the Egyptians, and the Southerners saw themselves as God's people, Israel, God's chosen people. Again, who is Israel? On the other side of that coin, African Americans fleeing slavery or segregation in the South have often seen themselves as, in this story, as the Hebrew slaves, and God is authorizing their release and their salvation over their enslavers, white people in the South, or segregationists, pro-slavery people who wanted to keep them in oppression or slavery. And more recently, liberation theologians in the 20th century have rejected economic and racial oppression and injustice by pointing again to this story of the Exodus and seeing themselves and oppressed, poor and oppressed people of the world as the Hebrew slaves that God was empowering to seek salvation and release. I put here just a couple of other examples that I might point to as ways that passages that have been racialized in many of our readings by white Americans historically. So one big one is Genesis 9, the curse of Canaan, which is often called the curse of Ham. And so this idea uses the Genesis 10, the table of nations, where you're talking about the different tribes and things like that, to say that it's okay in its original context, it's okay to enslave Canaanites. It's okay for Israelites to enslave Canaanites because God has cursed them because of something that one of Noah's sons, Ham, did at the end of the flood story, right? And if white Americans see themselves as Israel, it's okay for them to enslave African Americans, for example, because they're cursed. They're under this curse of Canaan because they can be interpreted to be Hamites or descendants of Ham, the way that the three sons of Noah in the history of Christian interpretation have been identified with different areas of the world, right? So Ham was interpreted as Africa and the peoples of Africa. Shem was the peoples of Asia. That's why a lot of times Shem or Semites, anti-Semites is directed against people in the Middle East, Jews, for example. And then Japheth was identified with Europe. And so many of the history of Christian interpretation, Christian interpreters have read themselves, European white people as sons of Japheth and Black African people as sons of Ham. And so this curse, they read this curse as applying to them, and then it's okay to enslave them. Many segregationists and others still today use this Genesis 11 Tower of Babel story to talk about how God separated the races and meant for the races to be separate, because when they all tried to come together and live as one people and build this Tower of Babel, God scattered them and separated them and said that they should live separately. And so a lot of segregationists and white supremacists will point to this passage of Genesis 11 and say that God intends for the races to be separate and not live together. There's a story in Numbers 12 that Moses takes a Cushite wife. Cushites is a term in the Bible that's often translated Ethiopian. It was a nation that was just to the south of Egypt, somewhat similar to Sudan today in Africa. And so the idea that Moses would take this Cushite wife has been read by many, especially European Americans, that Moses is Israelite, we are Israelite, and Cushites or Ethiopians are Black. And so there's this interracial marriage, has the way that it's often been interpreted in European and American interpretation. And so that, as opposed to this story, that's okay, because God has, even Moses was engaged in this interracial marriage, so it's okay. We don't have to live separately. Psalm 68 and talks about how powerful and desirable and good the Cushites and Ethiopians are, having to do with the context of Cush actually ruled over Egypt for a time. One of the Egyptian dynasties was led by a Cushite pharaoh. And so this was around the time that much of the Hebrew Bible was being written. And so, especially today, more and more interpreters think that Cushites, instead of being identified with, a lower class Black person, as we might think of in the United States, in modern United States interpretation, that actually Cushites or Ethiopians were rich and powerful and strong nations that were dominating Egypt at the time. And so a lot of African Americans will point to this in more recent history and talk about how the Bible talks about is affirming of Cushite, Ethiopian, African, Black people, instead of maybe some kind of negative curse or something like that. Likewise, in the New Testament, in Acts 8, we have this story of the baptism of the Ethiopian. So the first person, non-Jewish person who is baptized as a Christian is this Ethiopian official. And so people will also point to that as a way that, race should not be seen as negative in the Bible, but actually, if anything, it's the opposite, that God is choosing Africans and Ethiopians to be the special recipients of God's grace. So this is kind of the main point of this talk, but who are we? Where do we see ourselves when we read the Bible? How do we understand ourselves socially, culturally, historically? Who's included in us or we, and who do we see as other, you, them? So there's two kind of intertwined ideas here of universality and particularity. A universality being, everyone is included, and particularity being there's just one special group or special chosen people. So for example, universality, God's love is for everyone, salvation, or using particularity to read the Bible, then God's concern or salvation is only for Israel or only for Christians, as opposed to all humanity. So that's kind of two different competing, but both existing ideas in the Bible, in both the Old and New Testaments. So we can look at a text like Galatians 3:28 that argues for inclusivity, racial justice, and common humanity. It says, there's no male and female, there's no Greek nor Jew, there's no slave nor free, we're all one in Christ Jesus, right? And so it's talking about gender, this ethnicity and race idea between Greeks and Jews, and the idea that regardless of I would say, there when it's talking about slavery and freedom, again, it's talking about social and economic status. It's not talking about race, but we often read race into that in a white American context. Both particularity and universality are present in both the Old and New Testaments. So it's not just that many Christians, I think, will kind of assume that the Old Testament is, particular, it's just talking about Jews and Israel, but the New Testament is, completely different and is for everybody. Anybody can be a Christian. But when you look at it more closely, there's both of these ideas in both the Old and in the New Testament. So yes, you can read the Old Testament as just for Jews, but there's also passages like in Isaiah where it says, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations, right? For everyone is welcome and a part of God's family. And in the New Testament, Christians might assume that it's for everyone, but there's many passages in the New Testament that talk about, if you don't believe certain things or if you don't do certain things, that you're out. You're cast out into the outer darkness or the hellfire or different things like that. And people will often point to that. In fact, I was just traveling on I-40 at a rest area, and someone had the radio on a Sunday talking about all the evil doers and how they were going to burn and things like that. So there's a lot of Christianity that's also very particular, I think. So what can we as religious people do to contribute to racial justice in the United States today? That is, how can we read the Bible? How can we live our lives? How can we practice our religion, our Christianity in a way that contributes and not takes away from racial justice? So the first thing I would say is be more aware of how whiteness has become central in our culture, in our society. This idea is sometimes called hegemony. So white hegemony, it just basically means that whiteness has become the norm or this central way that many people, especially white American people, see the culture and the structures of the United States. How does that assumption of white normativity affect and influence religion and culture? So I've alluded to today about how many white American Christians will see themselves as the main characters of the Bible. We see ourselves as Israel, and we see everything in the Bible talking about Israel, talking about us, and things that are talking about other tribes or groups, talking about other people, primarily, non-white people. Now, we might not come out and say that, but I think that's often the implication, and that's often the way that many of us just sort of interpret that internally. So, for example, I grew up as a Baptist. There was a lot of talk about the Great Commission in the Gospel of Matthew 28 about go ye therefore into all the world and make disciples of all the nations. There's that word nations again. So God is commanding us as the chosen people of Israel to go out and make disciples of other people. And so I'll just say the way that I assumed or interpreted that as a white person growing up in Memphis in the church, that meant that I as a white Christian person was commanded to go out and help other people, the least deserving, those who needed other things. And so in my sort of middle class white culture, I saw that as primarily as non-white or non-American. That's the way that I sort of interpret it and assume that. And I don't think I'm totally alone in that idea. So how can we question and decenter the way that whiteness affects our religious communities and in our personal daily interactions? This is kind of the larger question that I hope that you'll think about and take away from. So when we talk about race in the Bible in the United States, many white Americans have read ourselves as the center of the story, as the subject of the story. And what I'm suggesting is that we think of it more in terms of a circle of many different people, not just that necessarily that we're at the center and everyone else is outside of the center, but that we broaden the circle so that we're one of many other different peoples and different types of peoples that God is concerned about and that we should be concerned about and that should be included in our we. Any questions or?
Not sure if it's who's reading it. I mean, if you're interpreting it from your standpoint as a white person, but if you were of another ethnicity and reading the same thing, would you have a different?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that's a little bit what I was trying to refer to when I talked about how the Exodus story has been read by different peoples in different ways. So, white people would read the Exodus story as applying to them, and African Americans might read the Exodus story as applying to them. So yes, I do think that in part it determines on who's reading it and how they're interpreting it, and are they seeing themselves as the center of the story or not. And I think
everybody sees themselves as the center.
Everyone does. However, I think there's an special concern that white Americans, because of our history of power and laws and the history of white supremacy in the United States, white supremacy, I don't mean just the KKK, I just mean this idea that white culture is somehow more evolved or more advanced or more, we might not say agree to that necessarily today, but I think that many of us were sort of raised with those cultural ideas, even if we don't agree with them, about the importance of European culture and how that's influenced the United States and how the United States has a special place in the world to spread good economics and democracy and things like that. So I think there's a special concern that white American Christians have, that we don't allow these cultural messages to dominate or take over the way that we read the Bible, that we understand our religion, I guess is what I'm suggesting.
There's a note from the chat. There's a book from Elizabeth Jemison called Christian Citizens Reading the Bible in Black and White in the Post-Emancipation South. I think she's from Memphis.
Great, yeah, thank you. Thank you for.
I couldn't hear what he said.
He said there's a book. Can you just say that maybe again, Daniel?
The writer is Elizabeth Jemison. The book is called Christian Citizens Reading the Bible in Black and White in the Post-Emancipation South.
No.
So there's a suggestion of a book that goes into how different white and black readers or interpreters have read different, which sounds really interesting. Thank you for sharing. Any other comments, questions? I certainly appreciate your participation and willingness. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
I knew it last one. This there, not with them. Yes.